All right, so we will get everything started in a few minutes. People are logging in right now. We're up to about 500 participants. So a couple minutes and then we'll get everything started. Kate, you ready? Iris, ready? Everyone? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the very first Archaeology Abridged talk of 2022. Just a couple announcements before I turn it over to Letitia, who will introduce our speaker for today, Kate Liszka. We do have ASL interpreters, as you can tell. Unfortunately, that is only available on a desktop version. If you're looking at it on a mobile and you do want to access the ASL interpretation, please switch over to a desktop. The other thing is that we are recording this presentation. So please know that, and we ask that you don't record it personally. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and for everyone that's registered, we will send you a link as soon as the recording is ready. So you'll be able to watch this again, and that also will help people who missed the talk today. So we'll take care of the recording. After the talk, there will be time for questions and answers. Please put your questions in the Q&A box or window of on the Zoom webinar, as opposed to the chat window. The chat window, you will see, gets a lot of activity, and we may miss your question. So if you want us to get to your question, please put it in the Q&A box. All right, that's all I need to say. I am now going to turn it over to AIA President Letitia LaFollette.
Thank you very much, Ben. So welcome, everyone. It's always a delight to see where you're coming from in the chat. We have people from Greece, all over the United States, from Argentina, Canada. It's great. So welcome all. I'm Letitia LaFollette. I'm the president of the AIA, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Archaeology Abridged, as Ben said, the very first one of 2022, featuring Dr. Kate Liszka, talking to us about Operation Amethyst, how Egyptian kings and queens got their bling 4,000 years ago. So let me introduce our speaker so you know a little bit about her. Dr. Kate Liszka is the Benson and Pamela Harrer Fellow in Egyptology and Associate Professor of History at California State University, San Bernardino. She earned her doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, and from 2012 to 2015 was Coates and Postdoctoral Fellow and lecturer at Princeton. Her areas of specialization include Nubians in Egypt, the Magi, ethnicity and identity in antiquity, multicultural interactions in frontier regions, the Pangrave archaeological culture, and large-scale mining expeditions in antiquity. Dr. Liszka is also the director of the Wadi el-Hudi expedition in the Egyptian Eastern Desert. And I am delighted to turn it over now to Dr. Kate Liszka.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Let me just share my screen. Ben, you need to stop sharing your screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm so thrilled to see so many people out there and a number of friends in the audience too. Thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. So before I start today, I just wanted to give an absolutely enormous thank you to the AIA for giving me this opportunity to share my team's research with you. And I would especially like to thank Maria Vecchiotti, who is an AIA board member. She's an integral member of our team and a supporter of our team for Wadi el-Hudi. So thank you, Maria. We really couldn't have done a lot of this work without you. So the setting. 4,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptian Middle Kingdom. I want you to sit back and imagine a world without the color purple in it, except for a couple of hints and glimmers here and there. So occasionally a piece might be found, but it was really rare. This was before people could actually make purple. It took the Greeks and the Romans another 1,000 years to learn how to do that with snail shells. So purple only occurred naturally in the environment. And the Egyptians didn't know the location of a lot of these places at this time. And then they found purple from amethyst at Wadi el-Hudi. And it brought a color into their world in a way that was really never done before. And they kind of went crazy for it. The pharaohs would send people to the ends of the earth to get it, right? They would brave terrible weather and extreme environments, heats and insects and really drastic landscapes and deplorable work conditions. For what? Well, amethyst. It's a beautiful stone, right? But it has absolutely no utilitarian purpose except for being incorporated into really awesome jewelry. But yet these ventures seemed worthwhile in many ways. So in 2014, since 2014, I've directed the Wadi el-Hudi expedition to the Eastern Desert of Egypt. And my team has spent a few years following in the footsteps of these ancient explorers and expeditioneers. We've found clues of their good times and of their bad. And we've learned firsthand about some of the obstacles that they had to surpass to even get this beautiful gem in the first place. So today, my plan is to walk you through the life story of a beautiful amethyst object, right? And the extreme lengths that the Egyptians went through in order to outfit their kings and their queens with this type of bling. So the next time when you're in a museum, looking at an ancient Egyptian amethyst object, I want you to think of the hundreds, if not thousands of people that really risked their lives to make this object come into existence. But before we get into that story, we need to address why. Why would they do this? I mean, today, amethyst is pretty standard. It is inexpensive. It's a semi-precious stone, but that was definitely not the case in the ancient world. And it was really valuable for quite a few reasons. First, as I mentioned before, the color purple was exceedingly rare and unique, raising its value. And second, the pharaoh and his treasury were likely the ones that controlled this entire supply of the stone. It was practically impossible to buy amethyst, almost like, trying to buy a moon rock today. You can't just go and do that. So instead, it would have had to have been gifted to you by the pharaoh, which raised its innate value. So this is a mineral of very, very high prestige that the pharaoh then gifts to his favorite courtiers, but also probably to other international kings too. So because of its high prestige behind this object, it was certainly incorporated into aspects of international diplomacy at the time. Contemporary amethyst objects have actually been found in the Levant, Mesopotamia, in Mycenae and elsewhere. And in fact, one of our long-term projects for our team is to geologically try to fingerprint the mineral makeup of the amethyst from the Wadi el-Hudi mines, so that in the future, museum collections and other excavations can do the same thing. That way we can actually trace the patterns of this prestigious diplomatic trade through items like amethyst. But anyway, I digress. Of course, because amethyst is so expensive and so prestigious, the stone was also heaped with magical and religious meanings too. So amethyst was incorporated into shrines that were built for gods and other religious objects. But amethyst was sexy. I mean, literally sexy, right? Coffin text 576 was recited over a bead of carnelian or amethyst, and its result is basically spelled out in the spell's title. As for any man who knows this spell, he shall have sex in the land by day or by night, and he will have the heart of the woman beneath him when he has sex. So you can see why the kings of Egypt would risk so much time and so many resources for what is essentially a very beautiful rock. So Wadi el-Hudi is a region in the Egyptian Eastern Desert, southeast of Aswan. And like today, Aswan is the closest big city to the area. And it definitely supported all of the expeditions in the past, present, and probably future too. So geologically, this region is incredibly rare because it's where the Precambrian basement of metamorphic gneiss merges with the significantly younger Cretaceous Nubian sandstones from younger granites. Okay, for those of you like me who don't speak geologist, it's basically where a bunch of old rocks and a bunch of young rocks get together and smash together. And in this lumpy mix, they create really cool minerals like amethyst, gold, mica, and more. But it is a really rare and cool, drastic landscape that I'm kind of guessing looks like the surface of Mars, although I've never been to Mars. But you have very deep patches of sand. And then you also have these sharp boulders that jump up from the mountains, which basically means that you can both get your car stuck in the sand and slice its tire on a rock, sometimes in the same day, if you're super lucky, speaking from experience. But basically, every mountain, every valley has its own geological personality. Plus, because the soil particles are pretty tiny and the rocks are heavy, it means that there's not a lot of wind-blown sand. There's not a lot of buildup of soil deposition over time. So this is awesome for archaeologists because basically it's like walking into a time machine where you can see the first level of archaeological deposition on the surface without digging it. It's so cool. And luckily, some of our miners were very sloppy people. And so they often didn't take their trash out and left their trash right next to where they actually did the activity that created the trash. So we can discern a lot from the past just by walking around and looking at things too. So before the Pharaoh would actually send large expeditions into the desert, someone needs to, find the amethyst first and confirm that the vein is so big that it's really worth their extensive amounts of government resources. So over the last 8 years, our archaeological work has surveyed the entire region of Wadi el-Hudi, not just the 3 large mines and settlements that were discovered in the 1940s. We've now discovered upwards of 46 archaeological sites in the area. And a lot of the information about how this larger region works as a unit kind of comes together when you do this very large type of look at an area. And we've discerned a couple of things. First, we now have evidence for some pastoral nomads moving through the region. Although we don't really quite know when they date to yet, we're working on it. We have found evidence for some small cemeteries of pastoral nomads, and they're placed at the mouths of wadis on like small crests of the hill. So for those of you guys who don't study the Eastern Desert pastoral nomads, that's kind of a normal trend. They look for these mouths of wadis for their burials. And additionally, if you look at our inscriptions from Site 6, there are in fact animals or older drawings with a very different patina than our soldier drawings. So we have a lot of inscriptions at Wadi el-Hudi, and there's actually probably about 1,000 years difference between these two images on the object. Our animals here are probably 5,000 years old, where our miners are only near 4,000 years old. But you can see people like moving through the desert in this area too. And maybe these locals actually shared some of their knowledge of the landscapes with the Egyptians. We can't really prove that. We just know that they are in the area. So second, because of this very large regional survey, we now have a lot of evidence for ancient Egyptian prospectors. So about 20 of these sites are actually, prospectors' mines, these very small scale mines that kind of dot all over the region. And typically this is just a hole in the ground that's usually about, like 20 feet in diameter, maybe about 6 to 8 meters, that type of thing. And there are spoil heaps that are mounded next to the hole that came out of it. Now, archaeologically, besides the hole, very little else exists around these prospecting areas. I mean, they might have had a couple of small pieces of pottery or maybe some windbreaks or some small huts, like, 1 to 4. But these guys are basically like sleeping under the stars and being integrated into the elements with every moment of their day. And they would have received very little support from anyone at all. So I really have no idea where they, got their food and water, that type of thing. Maybe they packed it in, but who knows? Anyway, these prospector mines are kind of everywhere. And even when we have one of our giant mines, as in the large mine at Site 9, we still see 2 other small, starter mines or prospector mines that were in the same area. So they're always looking for these larger veins. But once the ancient Egyptian government understood the possibilities of these gems that lay in the desert, the pharaoh would order temporary expeditions, every few years. And these expeditions would last a couple of months, possibly even up to a full year. And they were made up of hundreds, if not over 1,000 people. Now, the pharaoh wouldn't go himself. No, he doesn't do that. The pharaoh would often appoint a high official to be in charge of the whole thing. And basically, this person was usually affiliated with the office of the treasury, but not always. And the person would then essentially take a branch of the army or a large group of workers to get this genuinely impossible task done. Now, fortunately, many of these high officials would also commission a lengthy historical inscription telling us about their expeditions. And we currently have over 280 rock inscriptions from Wadi el-Hudi. And basically every time we go out into the desert, we find more, which is really awesome. But these historical inscriptions are written by a top official, and they really give us some very amazing information. So Wadi el-Hudi 6, which you see here, was actually made during the reign of Sinwazir I in year 17. So that's something like 1950 BC, so nearly 4,000 years ago. And we see the person who wrote the inscription and was in charge of it. It was a steward, a guy by the name of Hetipu. And he came out with the army of the Lord, the king, right? So he's coming out with the army specifically to fetch amethyst. They're telling us why they're there. For every ka of the Lord, let prosperity help. Essentially, for a large circumlocution, meaning the king, we went to go get amethyst. Why? For the king. Now, he brought his number 2 with him, a guy by the name of Resuware. And these 2 were basically in charge of everybody else. So they have 1,000 young guys from the city of Thebes. That's the modern town of Luxor today. And these were probably the unskilled laborers doing a lot of the grunt work. We also have 300 soldiers that come from Elephantine and Komombo. Elephantine is the island in the middle of Aswan, so it's basically the same city that's supplying these expeditions anyway. Komombo is just like 40 miles or something like 50 kilometers north, so not very far away. And this is where you're getting your soldiers. Then there's upwards of about 200, mid-level, upper-level officials who are probably the skilled laborers, the ones that actually get involved with the ins and the outs of the actual mining process and how everything's supposed to come together. So when you add up all these people, we have over 1,500 people participating in one expedition. It's really sizable, especially when it comes to the logistics for 1,500 people. So first, you 1,500 people, they're basically marched into the middle of nowhere, right? Where are they going to live? And so we are trying to look at that archaeologically. Now, we do see at a number of our large settlements like Site 9, Site 5, and Site 4, which isn't seen here. We have large settlements that are built directly next to the mine. But we also know that these large settlements were purposely constructed only after they had started doing the mining. And that's because the stones that are used to build the walls are both from the surface, those are the darker colored ones, but then also from the mine, those are the pinkish colored ones. So they're, whoever's building these settlements are actually bringing together different sources of rocks at the same time. So the mines were already started at that point. But despite the fact that we have 1,500 people that we know are kind of part of these missions, we don't have space for 1,500 people to sleep. I mean, we can probably put maybe 200 people in the rooms at Site 5 and Site 9. So that's not 1,500. I mean, so I don't know. I honestly don't know where they're sleeping. I mean, maybe they're just sleeping outside. Maybe they're sleeping in interior courtyards without any walls. We still need to answer this question. But also we see with each of these expeditions that as they came out, they also would build and expand these various settlements too. So we actually have a lot of evidence for phasing within the archaeology too. So for instance, at Site 5, we can see archaeological phasing in like this inscription here. So for those of you who don't read hieroglyphs, it's upside down. So whoever reused this stone, didn't care about the inscription. They basically just flipped the stone and put it into their wall. Similarly, down in the bottom right here, this inscription was in fact reused in a wall and would have been covered over as part of the wall. So like the same guy that wrote these weren't the ones that flipped them over and covered them over. So you can actually see like different levels of phasing in these settlements. So they're always kind of growing and changing a little bit. Now, these people who were part of these expeditions were out in the desert for months on end. And, if you're there from April through October, it is ungodly hot. So getting up to about 120 degrees during the day, and even in the early morning, it's over 90. So for those Europeans in the audience, that's something between 38 and 45 degrees. It's really crazy, crazy hot, right? So you'd think it might be a little better in the winter, but that's not necessarily the case because the desert loses all of its warmth at night and it can be really, really cold outside. And there can also be these harsh weather events like winds that come out of nowhere and turn into sandstorms, or flash floods that happen every 10 years, like the one that I was lucky enough to experience firsthand last November in Aswan. They came out of absolutely nowhere. So basically, there is no single good time of the year for a large expedition to stay in the desert for a long time. Moreover, I've learned from personal experience that you are not alone in the desert. There are so many bugs. And you're the only source of food, flies for miles. And so once they find you, they do not leave and they are relentless. It's nasty. Anyway, plus when it's hot and there's no wind at all, you're bitten by horrible sandflies that really are, a plague in many ways. And then there was one really weird day a couple of years back that I cannot explain it, but all of a sudden we were all covered in ladybugs, and the ladybugs were everywhere. It was just weird. And then of course there's rocks that you can, break your ankles on, other wild animals in the desert. And then of course I got to mention snakes too. There are a couple snakes out there. So this is all to say that it's not a pleasant environment to spend a significant amount of time on, especially without a hot shower at the end of the day. Like our team is fortunate to get most days. So anyway, logistics. The bigger problem with this isn't just the weather, right? Where do 1,500 people, how do they eat? How do they get their water? It's a lot of people, right? And water is clearly the most precious commodity in the desert. But for years, my team has scoured this large region, and we have not yet been able to definitively find something that we can call a well that they could have gotten their water from. Now, 3 miles away from sites 5 and 9, the big amethyst mining areas, there is a place called Site 8. And this is a geologically lower point in the landscape that might be closer to the water table, and it's definitely sandy there. but previous researchers have claimed that Site 8 is a well. But honestly, having studied now all of the prospectors mines and starter mines in the desert, they basically look exactly the same from the surface. And Site 8 it actually has 3 of these features. So if there was a well, like why would they have 3 different wells in the same area? It's kind of confusing. And at the same time, around these features, we don't have hundreds and hundreds of broken pottery water jars. So you would expect if it was a well, people would break their water jars and then they'd have all their trash around it and you'd be like, oh, cool, water was here. But that doesn't exist. Now, that being said, they might have been carrying water in animal skins, which we know that they did at some points, but then which would account for the lack of broken pottery jars or water jars there. But then that means that the starter mines, the prospectors mines, and the wells look even more similar archaeologically. So it's even harder to distinguish one from the other in that point. So last October, we spent a few days trying to get down to the bottom of this question. I mean, literally, we dug and we dug and we dug through the sand and cut along a face of stone in what is probably the most likely candidate for a well. But after about 2 meters, which I know is admittedly not very deep for a well, we did expose a rock surface that was very roughly and clearly cut rather than something that was smoothed by water, although the water table might be lower. And it doesn't have any visible stairs yet. And we found some rock crystals kind of stuck into the sides, embedded into the sides. So we do not have a definitive answer yet. And I really do want to continue this trench again next time. But right now, it kind of looks more like a starter mine, a prospector's mine than it does a well. So that doesn't help. It means that these expeditions would have had to have brought water the whole way from the Nile. Like that is an incredibly long way for water for 1,500 people. Now, we know also that the administration took water very seriously. It was their most precious commodity, and they likely rationed water. We have a lot of archaeological evidence for this. So both at sites 4 and 5, there are very significant areas that were definitively controlled by the administration, where water was housed in these large zirs. So a zir is essentially a giant pottery jar for that both stores and cools water at the same time. And then they were likely passed out. The water was likely passed out in smaller jars that you see down below here for the actual people. So you can almost like see the workers lining up in a path, getting their water ration, and then going back to wherever it is to go. So water is still a very big problem that we're just leave for now and keep looking for evidence for. Food, they also need to eat. Now we're fairly sure that they are bringing pre-made bread from the Nile Valley rather than making it in the desert. That means that bakers and bakeries would have been supplying these people from the Nile. But at the same time, mining is hard work. It's a lot of labor. And the Egyptians recognized for that type of hard labor, you need to eat meat. And they actually supplied meat to their workers. We actually have a lot of evidence for animal bones in many different contexts. And some of these animal bones actually have like cut marks that occur when you're cooking, things like that. Plus the animals would have come from all over the place. So we have a lot of evidence of them eating gazelle, which were hunted locally. So that means that some of our 1,500 workers might have just been in charge of hunting local gazelle, but then also gathering local resources through the desert and bringing it back to the laborers. But there's also a lot of evidence for animals coming from the Nile Valley. So they ate a lot of sheep and goat. And they also had salted fish, which is definitely not local. We have fish bones really, really far away from the Nile, so they're bringing those in too. And we do have occasional cattle, although it wasn't as frequent. So this means that the mission into the desert needs to be actively and continuously supplied from the Nile Valley. And they would have done this through a caravan supply line. So you would have had, a large number of these 1,500 people would have basically been running a donkey supply train from the Nile Valley out into Wadi el-Hudi, some, 25 miles, 40 kilometers, that type of thing. And just this last November, we actually found much of the road that heads straight to Aswan. And the ancient Egyptians were nice enough to draw pottery from every period of its history along its sides for us to examine. So we know that they were walking along it kind of for thousands of miles. And in sections, this road can actually be really, really wide too. So in certain places, it is up to 13 meters wide, so some 40 feet in certain sections, plus where you have heavy areas of sand, where a path wouldn't stand out naturally, they actually lined it with stones. You can kind of see the stones here on the left and on the right. These are not natural. They are actively and purposely spaced in these locations. And you can actually see that in this map here, where every single one of these X's is an active stone that they put on the ground. So like they're creating a purposeful line for people to walk in this case. That means that this road was also so well known and so well marked that once it was created, anyone could get to Wadi el-Hudi, right? They didn't need a skilled caravan leader. They didn't really need a desert navigator once it was set up to escort people out there. It's pretty self-evident when a very large mission is working out there because they made it clear. Plus this road goes straight to Aswan, and it opens up into an area where the ancient fort of Abu likely was located on the east bank of Aswan. So obviously their supplies were coming from Aswan, and somebody in Aswan needs to be supplying these missions. But with the road kind of pointed at the fortress, maybe it was military personnel that were actually in charge of this, in doing this. Like we know for other places in Lower Nubia, forts are in control of mining areas in the desert too. So maybe that was what's going on, although we still need to do a lot of work to prove that point. So I might retract that, next week if we find more evidence. But for now, it kind of looks like a good idea. So perhaps some of these 1,500 people were also stationed in Aswan, working to support their mission in the desert. So let's recap really fast. We got about 1,500 people. Some of them were working along a large supply line. Some were hunting and gathering things locally in the desert. Some were building settlements. You also have a bunch of pencil pushing administrators pushing their pencils and overseeing the work. And so that leaves the actual miners, the hard laborers who are doing a lot of the work. And we have lots of evidence for mining. So workmen used a variety of mining tools during the Middle Kingdom. These tools are basically made out of hard stone and wood. When we get to the Roman period, 2,000 years later, I think they might have incorporated more iron tools in, but that was not the case in the Middle Kingdom when they didn't have iron. Yep. So these hard stone tools are actually easy to gather in the desert too. Just about 2 kilometers or 1.5 miles away from Site 9, there are a lot of these natural boulders that come out from the ground, so you can kind of grab a stone and go back to your work area. And that's where the majority of their heavy tools came from. And we also have lots and lots of different types of tools for work too, for different types of processes. So we have very large stones here that were hafted onto wood that could have acted like a hoe or a plow, something like that. We have large two-handed pounders or large one-handed pounders that would have pounded into some sort of anvil. You can notice this one has a curved end versus a pointed end for different types of hitting techniques. And then we have tools for more fine work too. So these ones on the right here would have just been placed in your hand for like fine actions. And this one with the curve along the edge would have been hafted onto a long piece of wood and almost kind of turned into an axe. In addition to that, we've also found evidence for a lot of baskets. So they're carrying things around in baskets, which you can kind of see over here on the right too. So there were a lot of different processes. So how was this work actually happening, right? Some of the people were probably actually in the mine, as you can see here, in charge of digging and carrying things out. And other people would, in fact, carry stones up and down along the side. In fact, in our Site 5 mine, we actually have a series of stairs right around here. And so they would carry out large stones, or they would carry out baskets with dirt and smaller stones in them. A lot of the spoil would be dumped right on the side of the mine, and then we would come down to the other side here where a workman would also be set up. And they would take their larger pieces of quartz, large pieces of stone, to try to extract the quartz. Okay, so side note here, amethyst is quartz. It's just a purple quartz. Amethyst quartz is usually like clear or milky white, but amethyst becomes purple when it's exposed to radiation due to impurities of iron or other metals. And so basically the clear, the white, and the purple are all kind of part of the same stone sometimes. So they all come together. And so they're trying to break off the granodiorite aspects of the mine and get to the quartz sections. So that would have happened in our first process of mining right next to the mine here. And then what happened is they probably heat treated these large pieces of quartz. And we know that because in almost every single one of our excavations, we have tons of these little hearths at the bottom. So every single one of these little holes in this picture was in fact a hearth at some point. And in these hearths, we have a lot of evidence of charcoal and amethyst coming together too. So they're not all used for cooking, that's for sure. And so in heat treating the stone, two specific things happen. It allows you to break off the pieces that you don't want easier, and it really brings out the color purple so that it is so much more vibrant than it would be otherwise. Now, on the other side of that equation, that means that if they're heat treating, they have to be burning a lot of things. So they need a lot of fuel for fire. And just this last season, we had a charcoal specialist come with us, and she was able to look at a lot of our charcoal and demonstrate that the trees that they're burning are local desert trees. So it almost seems like the same guys that are probably hunting the gazelle out in the desert are likely also cutting down trees and bringing them back to the areas of the miners. So this leads me to another thought, which of course I can't quite prove and we have to keep looking at. But if you're looking at the areas around Site 5, 4, and 9, those are really big mines where like hundreds of people work, there are no trees. None at all. But if you go further north to like the areas of the pastoral nomads, sites 42, 43, we finally get little trees in wadis that seem to have been there for a very, very long time. So I'm really starting to wonder if our miners 4,000 years ago might have caused some sort of like deforestation event, although it's not really a forest, so the word deforestation seems a little weird here. But you know, I also don't know why they didn't grow back over 4,000 years. Yeah, but they're questions. You know, they're clearly using their environment and bringing in more wood from the local area. Anyway, so the first level of refinement happens directly next to the mines on either side of the very large mines. But then you can see the administration getting involved and really taking a heavy hand at the types of things that are going on here. So the second level of administration at Site 5 would have actually have happened within this room right at the front. And there are very high walls around the room, along with a very thick area of broken milky quartz. So like people are watching it at this point and controlling what's happening in this zone. But then there was a third level of refinement. And the third level of refinement occurred in the same place that the water rations are likely passed out to the workers. This is in a courtyard at the very tippy top of a hill. So that's a strange place to actually like refine amethyst, because it means that you have to carry all of this dirt up to the top of the hill, which is not fun if you don't have to do that. So also, Site 5 is purposely built on a hill that uses natural boulders with a small courtyard at the top. But then around this, they built an inner wall that actively divides the area from the administration to where the housing areas were lower on the hill. And there were only two ways in and two ways out. And both of these ways in and out were highly protected and watched over through these boulder gateways that soldiers would have sat on top of and watched out of. So they'd know who was coming and going. And then in this courtyard at the top, that's where the third and final level of refinement happened, where you actually finished knocking off all of the milky quartz and got down into the purple quartz, the amethyst, the stuff that you actually wanted. So the administration is definitely micromanaging things at this particular level. So this process, despite the vast number of people and the grueling conditions, like really seemed worthwhile in some cases. And so you start to ask, well, like, how much stuff did they get? So one particular inscription actually tells us that after a full year, that their expedition managed to gather 150 hecot of amethyst. So that's something like 180 gallons or 680 liters. So it's basically a small closet full of amethyst in many ways. And this was enough, right? The small closet was enough for 1,500 workers and a whole year of grueling labor. Now, this raw amethyst was then brought back to the Nile Valley, and it was likely headed straight for the Pharaoh's treasury. And then the Pharaoh would dole out the raw amethyst to different types of workshops that specialize in various types of gem carving. And we know this because raw amethyst workshops, or because stone workshops with raw amethyst in them have been found on Elephantine Island, which is the island in the middle of Aswan. So it's basically the same as Aswan. And then also hundreds of miles further north in the capital, right where the Pharaoh would have controlled those particular mines as well. So the Pharaoh is taking charge of the different workshops that actually get this product and get the ability to then turn it into beautiful jewelry. Then once in the Nile and once at these craftsmen's workshops, that's where you would have the various craftsmen who labored over the beauty of the objects, right? They were the ones who shaped them and polished them and drilled them so they'd have their holes and inlaid them. And then they would finally give these gorgeous products back to the Pharaoh for his control. So this feels a little weird today because, you know, amethyst is not that valuable today, right? But you have to remember it's incredibly high value 4,000 years ago because of its rarity, because of its prestige, and the appearance of a whole new color that couldn't be found or made anywhere else in the world. And so the next time that you're in a museum looking at, you know, jewelry of like a princess, like say Princess Siddhartha unit that's on display at the Metropolitan Museum of in New York City, I want you to think about the deep level of control that her dad had over thousands of people to bring her these absolutely amazing and unique and prestigious items. He basically sent people to the ends of the earth to get them. So thank you very much for attending. And thank you for everybody who has been involved and supported our work in every way. Are there any questions?
Yes, there are a ton of questions, Kate. Let me just get to them in a second. Okay, so I've tried to organize the questions. Should we stop sharing your screen so that people can see you?
Sure.
All right. So there are questions. I've tried to organize them into themes, but let's start with this one, Kate, because I think a lot of people are curious. I am as well, as is Doug Tilden, friend of the AIA. How did you first get interested in Wadi el-Hudi? What drew you to this space?
Hi, Doug. He's a friend and supporter of our team too. Anyway, what got me involved? Well, that's kind of a long question. So short answer. I wanted to run an archaeological project, and my dissertation was about the Medjay, who are Eastern Desert pastoral nomads at this time. I also have a lot of interest in questions of administration, urbanism, fortifications, and basically how organization happens. And our co-director, Brian Kramer, was helping us come up with an area to look at. I also wanted specifically a place that was logistically easy. I know the whole talk was about how it's logistically difficult, but because there's a road that goes most of the way out to Wadi el-Hudi, we actually commute each day, so we can stay in Aswan and have, you know, like food and electricity when we need it. So it was logistically simple to do, and it seemed to fit well with a lot of the larger questions of interactions between pastoral nomads. So it fits. It was logistically easy, and it's a very cool site. So 3 of us actually run the project, Brian Kramer and Meredith Brand, and it fit with all of our research interests as well. So it's been a lot of fun.
Okay, if I seem distracted, it's because I'm looking at the questions. I'm listening.
That's okay.
A couple questions about amethyst itself. Where else in the world can amethyst be found, both in antiquity and today? A quick answer to that.
Yeah, okay. So today, amethyst is found everywhere. It's found in Madagascar, it's found in Brazil, it's found all around the world, to the point where the amethyst in Egypt is almost non-existent compared to other places. But that is not the case in antiquity. Now, Pliny the Elder, which is like 2,000 years after my guys in the Middle Kingdom, Pliny the Elder actually tells us where amethyst was found in the ancient world. He was Greek, and in fact, the word amethyst is actually a Greek word, amethystos, which I believe means the drunken one, which is very interesting. Especially because the Greeks thought that amethyst actually helped protect from drunkenness or hangovers, that type of thing. Anyway, so Pliny the Elder says that in the ancient world, the good amethyst came from Egypt, from India, from Petra, from a place that I'm currently forgetting. Sorry, I should know this, up in Turkey. And then some lesser quality amethyst also comes from an area around Greece too. So there are basically 6 places, but he said that the really good stuff comes from India and in Egypt at that point. Yeah.
Okay. And another sort of technical question about amethyst: does it occur in continuous veins or in isolated geodes?
Well, I think both, although I'm not a geologist. So for all those geologists out there that are actively correcting me, I apologize. We do have aspects of actual veins that they can follow, but I've seen it broken into geodes too. So I think there are more veins out where we are.
Okay. And then keeping with the theme of amethyst, again, the color purple. So you had the sort of sexuality connotations, or at least that's one of the things that they're talking about. But does it have any other significance, sort of like in Rome, you know, the connection to royalty? Is that a direct connection they're making, the color purple?
Well, the color purple becomes really significant when the Greeks and the Romans can make it. But this is 1,000 years later. They start to learn how to make it from snail shells, I think around 1000 BC. But we're at about 2000 BC at this point, so they couldn't make it then. So yes, the color purple changes its meaning at that point, and it has been established in royalty at that point because it was really hard to make. And of course, any emperors would, you know, don the purple and actively wear purple, but that was in part because it was so rare. I mean, you even get that into medieval Europe with, you know, French kings only wearing purple too. And it's because it was very hard to make and very rare, and because it comes out of this tradition of incredible rarity.
A lot of questions about the climate. Was the climate the same? The climate, and I will lump this in with vegetation, was that the same at the time in the past as it is now?
Mostly. I mean, it might have changed, but not terribly extremely, right? Like it was definitely a desert. It might have dried out a little bit more, still was not pleasant. There was probably a larger climate change in Egypt around, you know, something like 2200, 2300 BC, but that also predates when they found the amethyst. So it would have happened like 200 or 300 years earlier. That might have changed some pastoral nomadic patterns and the number of pastoral nomads in the area. But we are looking for that type of evidence. but I'm assuming that, maybe it was slightly wetter with a couple more trees, but it certainly was not, nice at this point.
Okay.
I mean, deserts are nice. Let me take that back. I don't mean to be mean to deserts out there.
We have a lot of questions about the workers themselves. So one quick sort of definition: does 1,000 arms mean 500 people or 1,000 people?
It means 1,000 people.
Means 1,000 people. Okay.
Yeah.
Were the workers prisoners or regular people? Several people asked this.
Ah, yes. Well, see my talk in February 17th. We are trying to answer that question. And it's actually a debate between our team as to whether or not they are prisoners, conscripted laborers, or skilled laborers. And we're kind of on the fence about this because we sometimes have evidence that says both. And I will go into detail about that particular question in a couple of weeks. But I guess if you want me to spoil it now, probably skilled a little bit, mostly skilled. But I don't know, with every new piece of evidence, we're always changing our ideas. So, I could be swayed the other way.
All right, so we'll leave it at that because I will ask you the question about the evidence after your next talk in February.
Sure.
Specific kind of evidence, but let's leave it at that for this. Now, the other question considering workers, were there women at the site?
There were probably no women.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, everybody mentioned in the inscriptions are men, and that just seems out of place for work roles. We do know that women did work in Egypt, but they're usually going to be your bakers and your weavers. So if women were support staff here, they would have been the ones in the Nile Valley. They wouldn't have been the ones out in the desert.
Okay. Now, with the folks out there, I mean, the conditions are harsh. It's hard work. Do you have evidence for people who may have died while on the expedition? Are there graves?
Yeah. Okay. So we have actively tried to address this question because one would assume that people died out there, and we have actively tried to, look for graves of people coming from the Nile Valley for Egyptians. We do now have graves of pastoral nomads, but they're not the same as our expeditioners, right?
Yeah.
So we have found all of these like piles of rocks that kind of look like tumuli found in Sudan for Nubian workers, and one of our chief field archaeologist, Magdalena Włodarska, is like personally excavated hundreds of tombs, so she really knows what she's looking at when it comes to a grave. And she sees all these piles of rocks right next to Site 5, and she's like, I think these are tombs, let's go excavate. So we excavated 3 of them, 3 different ones. She set them up in a pile, and it turns out that they're just piles of rocks. There's absolutely nothing underneath of them, which leads to all these questions like, what are they doing? Why are they just like piling these rocks out here in some sort of non pattern? It doesn't really make any sense. So that is still one of our big questions. But the more that we think about this, I'm pretty sure that if anything bad happened, and of course something would happen, their bodies were likely brought back to the Nile, right? I mean, you have a continuous train of caravanners that it only takes like 2 days, probably maybe a day if they're really going fast, to get back to and from the Nile. So it wouldn't have been out of the question to bring the bodies back. Plus, if you look at Egyptian religion, there are a lot of inscriptions that talk about how they want to be brought back home, how they want to be brought back to the Nile. So it would be pretty disrespectful just to leave them out there and not bring them back to their families. So I think that, evidence can change daily, but I think that anybody who would have died would have had the dignity to be brought back to the Nile very properly.
Okay. Yeah, that would also be sort of tough to figure out, that sort of absence of evidence there.
Yeah.
For the folks, so their questions kind of sort of rotating around, revolving around religion. So Leslie says, Seth was believed to be the Egyptian god who protected travelers in the desert. Discover any monuments or inscriptions requesting his protection? And along with that, is there any evidence for personal worship going on within these worker settlements?
Great question. No. But let me kind of clarify that. We don't have any evidence of personal worship. We just haven't found the artifacts yet. But even with our inscriptions, we don't have a lot of mentions of local deities, with the exception of a couple of historic inscriptions that might have mentioned one god. Now there is one stele, but this stele is super weird because it dates to the New Kingdom. Okay, so our mines in Wadi el-Hudi are all from the Middle Kingdom or the Roman period, and we have nothing from the New Kingdom. It's like 300 years later. And yet, even though I don't have a single piece of New Kingdom pottery from 300 years later, and we know that they did not reopen the mines, the one thing we do have is a beautiful stele from a guy by the name of Ususatet, who is the king's son of Kush. So if you know anything about Egyptian administration, he was kind of on the level of the vizier that ran everything south of Egypt and into the desert. So like this is his jurisdiction.
Right.
And he carried or had some guy carry a stele 20 miles, 35 kilometers out in the desert and leave this there that basically gives his name and says he's the king's son of Kush. But it also has a picture of him worshiping the goddesses of Hathor and Satet, which makes sense because the local goddesses of Aswan are Satet, and Hathor is kind of connected with the desert. So in Leslie's question, she specifically mentioned Seth. It wouldn't have been Seth. Probably not Min, which also has other good evidence, even though you didn't ask about it. But it was, if there was a god that was worshipped there, it was probably Hathor or Satet. But our evidence comes from 300 years after, when the miners were there. So, you know, it's like the more work I do, the more questions I have.
So a lot of questions about the mining process itself, but let's, how long were the mines used? How deep did they go? And along with that, this idea of expeditions, were there other materials or minerals that the pharaoh sent large expeditions out to?
Okay, great questions. So we don't know how deep the mines were yet, because they of course collect sand at the bottom of them. We have not excavated to the bottom of one. I would like to core down to them in a future season, but we need to get a specific coring specialist to come out with us. So we're not really sure, but they're pretty big. They are open pit mines. They would have been started in the Middle Kingdom, but miners always go to the same spaces that other miners were. So even though they're enormous, the Middle Kingdom mine would have been smaller, then expanded on by the Romans, and then expanded on by other people. So for instance, if you look at the Site 4 mine, it's enormous, and you can actually see areas where, you know, on the one side, they're probably the older areas of mining, and then on the other side, there's this different cut of the rocks. You think it's the younger mining. But, you know, it didn't stop with the Romans. You know, people actively use these mines just on smaller scales, even until the modern day. And they were originally found by an Egyptian geologist by the name of Labib Nassim in 1917 through like 1925. And the reason that he was out there was because he was prospecting for minerals for the Egyptian government. And so what do? You go to the same place that the old mines have been. And even today, we're fighting off modern mining expeditions. And these sites actually are in desperate danger of being destroyed because people still go to these areas to mine. Now, in this particular region, you have amethyst from the ancient world. Later, significantly later, like maybe 500 or even 900 CE, they find gold. And there is a lot of gold mining out in the same region. But the ancient Egyptians at 4000 BC didn't know the gold was out there, and neither did the Roman expeditions out there, probably around 100 BC, 100 AD. They're really just looking for the amethyst. So the gold mining that happens in the area is significantly later. And those all seem to be small scale minings up until the Ottoman period or present day, although we still need to research that question. I actually haven't, anyway. So the last part of that was, did the Pharaoh run these large expeditions? This isn't the only place where Egypt has mines. I mean, this is where they went for the amethyst, right? But There are other places, especially out in the Sinai, where they are excavating a lot of turquoise and a lot of other important elements too. So they did have experience with running these types of expeditions. This is just a new place for a new type of mineral.
So these precious materials to them, the amethyst and the turquoise, is this a state monopoly? Does the king control all the sort of the access to these gemstones and these precious materials, or how does that work? What is a private citizen able to do in these?
He controlled the majority of it because these large expeditions had to have been organized by the king and were organized by the king. However, we do have evidence of small scale, I guess, artisan mining going out and getting some, but this would have been, 10 guys, 15 guys taking what they can carry. This isn't, 1,500 people doing this type of work. So just on the sheer ability to get out there, a lot of these prospectors too would have also been small scale miners. So they would have brought back these things, but it's just the percentage of quantity would have been so highly controlled by the Pharaoh that he basically did all of it. I mean, maybe like, 98%.
Right. So it is 2 o'clock, but if you're okay, Kate, a couple more questions.
Sure.
One of which does connect to the drunkenness question. No, the question really was, is it just water, or would they have been taking fermented beverages like beer out with them or acquiring it, on their way to get to these spaces?
I mean, ancient Egyptians, their main quantities were bread and beer, right? Like that's what they ate and that's what they drank in the Nile. They started drinking beer at the age of 3, right after they weaned from their mother's milk. But it wasn't that alcoholic. It was very thick, almost like porridge. At the same time, so we haven't proven it yet, right? Like we don't really know if they were also transporting beer out there. It would have been a lot harder to take a liquid that wasn't water. So I out in the desert, I actually don't know if they brought their beer out or not.
One of the listeners was talking about they started with jade in China, and then they're talking about amethyst, but both being very hard to work. What was the kind of the process of working the amethyst, and how did you become an amethyst worker?
Okay, well, amethyst is pretty hard. I think it's like a 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness, so pretty hard. But at the same time, the Egyptians did know how to actually, if you were a stonemason or a jeweler, you would know how to do this. So for instance, if you're a stonemason, you would try to move the dirt around it, kind of pop it off. Also, you could use heat. We don't have evidence for this out in Wadi el-Hudi, but you can. There's a lot of evidence near Giza and the pyramids for how they break apart stone. Even down in Aswan around the unfinished obelisk, like how they break the stone apart by drilling holes and putting wood into it and soaking the wood and breaks it, and also using heat treatment to it. So they do know how to do these things. It's harder when you don't have the resources like the water and the wood that you would need in the desert to make a lot of it happen. If you're a professional jeweler, one of the things you would use is like with your drill bits, they would usually be made out of metal, but that's pretty hard, and they would have weights on either side of them. But along with the drilling, which you can actually saw that guy doing with the bow in the one image, it would rotate a drill fast, but then the drill would also, you would put sand at the bottom so that the sand would also act as an additional type of cutting device and make your drilling motions much more effective. And so it's hard work, but they actually became pretty adept at it. This would have been skills that you would have apprenticed for and learned from. So, yeah.
Okay, so last question. We started kind of with the logistics question. How did you get involved in this space in Wadi el-Hudi? Let's end with a kind of a logistics question as well. People are curious about like a quick snapshot of what's the process of getting to these sites, permits, permissions, did you have security that you had to go with? So just generally how you organize an excavation or an expedition. And did you find amethyst in your excavations?
Okay, so in short, yes, we have found amethyst in the excavations. It's never on the surface because when purple amethyst is exposed to the surface, the sun makes the purple go away and it becomes, your milky quartz or your clear quartz. But when we actually do have an excavated trench, we have found purple pieces. So that beautiful piece of purple that I've kept showing over and over again, that's one of our pieces from Site 4. Thanks to our photographer, Michael, for taking an awesome shot of it. Anyway, so as far as our permits go, it's complicated. We love working with the Egyptian government. We actually have to get a series of about 5 different permissions from the Ministry of Antiquities. And then it's in a military zone, so we have to get permissions from the army, the secret police, the military, the environment, and basically have them all line up in particular ways. So it's a process, but we've also been through it for several years. And, we have a lot of support in the Ministry of Antiquities, especially locally in Aswan, so that when the permissions come, we basically have to jump on the occasion that we actually have a window open, and then we go out and try to do some work before the permissions end and they close up again. So it's a bit of a thing. An inspector comes with us every single day out into the desert. So we are always working hand in hand with the ministry. Any of our artifacts goes directly to the Ministry of Antiquities official storage area in Aswan. And so if we're studying them after we bring them out of the desert, we study them in that magazine storage area. And it's all controlled by the ministry. Of course, we're not allowed to take anything out of the country, but even sending things to Cairo for specific type of testing, we also have to get special permissions for. So when we want to do like petrographic analysis or other types of things, we need to do an additional permission for that. But it is possible. It just, each step is a small step. But the Ministry of Antiquities has really worked hand in hand with us to make these things done right. So yeah.
All right, I think that's all the time that we have. Kate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, this is incredible. And again, this is not the end of it. Kate is going to give us another talk on February 17th, 2017. We will, of course, have all the information out for you, and we will reach out to everybody to remind them that Kate's going to be back with us in less than a month. Kate, thank you. Iris, Amber, thank you for your work. And thank you to everybody who tuned in to watch Kate.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Iris and Amber too. And if you want to learn more, we have a website, el-Hudi.com, and Facebook page and other things too. So thank you all so much. I hope to see you all in a couple weeks.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.